as we mark 20 years since the attack on the United States by Al-Qaeda. My next guest served as an officer of the Australian Regular Army for most of his life, before continuing to serve the nation as a Senator for New South Wales. During the war in Iraq, he held a senior position under American General David Petraeus. He's familiar to our Sky audience, and he generously agreed to speak to us tonight, despite his own ongoing battle against another fierce enemy, namely cancer. Well, Jim Molan, before we get on to the anniversary of 9/11, you were pretty involved in another op in 1999 called Operation Spitfire, as I recall, on this very day. Probably a cause for some reminiscence as well.
Yes, good evening, Catherine. It is a time for reminiscence, and it was interesting to hear John and you referring to the long war, and we have been through East Timor, and I think we came away from East Timor with a high degree of confidence in our own ability to do things. So I was working out of Jakarta, but I was actually located in Dili through all those days for the months before we conducted the insertion of Australian troops into Dili. We walked away feeling quite good about how we've operated, what we've done, and how almost all the organs had performed. So, yeah, it's a day for remembering, and there are some good memories there, but the long war then started after that, Catherine, and here we are now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of complacency bred by Timor. I know you and I discussed this early in the noughties, Jim, when we were reviewing a manuscript that an officer had written about our experience in Timor, and we both made the point that there had been no combined arms fighting in complex terrain, and it would be it'd be hubris for Australia to take too many lessons about our warfighting capability out of any of those operations. But look, where were you when you learned of the attacks? Were you up that evening, or had you turned in and found it the next morning?
No, I was sound asleep, and in Brisbane I was commander of the 1st Division, which at that time was an organisation of 15,000, most of the combat soldiers in the Australian Army. And Anne and I were sound asleep, and our daughter came in. And I forget the exact time, but she said, turn on the television, turn on the television. And it's interesting to think back on it, Catherine, because soldiering is a very practical business. So in soldiering, you see the results of what you're doing very, very quickly. You see the errors that you make, and you can count the dead bodies very, very quickly. Or in a training series, you see the successes and the failures of training. For most of my military career, I applied my brain to the challenges of what we in the military called operations, as you know, which kind of lies between tactics and strategy, and tactics. And that's what an officer should do. I made the assumption, really, that someone was doing the long-term thinking. And I remember on that night thinking, I wonder what this means, not just for the 1st Division, 15,000 soldiers, with some of the highest readiness organisations in the Defence Force in it. What does this mean for Australia? What does this mean for the world? What does it mean for the things we value, liberal democracy, and what's it mean for me, of course? And strange as it may seem in the short term, in the next couple of hours, it didn't mean anything at all. We were a very, very somnolent organisation. We checked the next morning, we checked that our security, or an increased level of security around the various bases, moved it to a higher level. But I didn't see anything at that stage that was going to take us where it did take us. And I wonder who else did.
Indeed, Jim, and I can recall our colleague and friend Gus Gilmore was seconded after he got back from Afghanistan to PM&C to look at continuity of government issues, but that was 3 or 4 years after the attacks that we started to look at continuity of government, redundancy of command structures and so on. And you're quite right, we had been sleepwalking ahead of it. But when did you first realise that Australian forces would be involved in this? Because you call it the 1st Division, but it was in that era known as the Deployable Joint Headquarters, wasn't it? And you would have had to get the high readiness units activated at some point. So when did you get notice to move for our first deployment?
Well, most of that worked outside the Deployable Joint Force Headquarters in the 1st Division, because most of it was Special Forces. So they operated through the Special Forces and deployed the Special Forces. So we watched on, we did what we could, we checked readiness. And what the Australian Army does, and the Australian Defence Force does very well, is prepare our troops for the short-term readiness requirements that we have. So we have various, as you know, levels of forces on 24 hours, on counter-terrorism even shorter, on 7 days, 14 days, 28 days. So we just checked all those out to make sure we were 100% aware of that and let the government work its way through all these problems. So I reckon we watched the Special Forces deploy. To this day, I was astonished that we did not deploy what we call cavalry forces with the Special Forces into the western part of Iraq. We left it up to Special Forces only. I was absolutely astonished that we didn't do that, but we didn't do it, and we achieved what we did achieve, and as per usual, the Special Forces did brilliantly, but we could have achieved a lot more and played a bigger role in the move in from Jordan and the various activities that occurred then. I reckon it's interesting to know, because 2004 and 5 I deployed, as you said, to Iraq as Chief of Operations. It wasn't under General Petraeus, it was under General George Casey.
My apologies, right.
No worries. I deployed as Chief of Operations, and it was an American position. So for a year there, I ran the war in Iraq for the Americans, the practical aspects of operations, which is information, warfighting operations, and the kind of things that you do with the community. So I remember one afternoon sitting in my office, I received a signal, a communication from out of the operations branch in Washington, and it was headed the Long War. And I thought, well, there you are. Here is an organisation which is looking towards the future. And this organisation, it was written by the head of operations in the United States Joint Operations, and he called it for the first time the Long War. And the Americans were positioning themselves for that war. And it wasn't just the generals. I found myself working with about 200 or 300, within a headquarters of about 1,000 people in the operations branch. There were a couple of hundred young Americans. Most of them were civilians who were in the National Guard or the Reserve or some form of American organisation that was not active, and the poor people were dragged into this, thrown into Iraq, and we formed a headquarters. Well, they were extraordinary. They personified to me the post 9/11 view of 9/11 being a threat to America, and they were in Iraq to fight, and if necessary to die, for the right for America to keep living.
And Jim, did you ever for a moment in that period think that the last Australian sortie would have left Kabul only weeks ago? Did you think it would, when we said long war, it would be that long?
No, I didn't, because as I said before, soldiering is so all-consuming, and as Chief of Operations at that stage, I was running today's war and the next couple of days' war, and others were running the future, which might be a month out, and others were running the long war, which was a long way out. But we had already gone into Afghanistan and then pulled out many of the troops from Afghanistan before we went back into Iraq. And I don't fully subscribe to this view that the reason that we failed in Afghanistan was because we went to Iraq. We had 150,000 American troops in Iraq. And between 2004-5, when I was there, and 2011, when we pulled out, we had achieved, I believe, an extraordinary amount. if there was any failure in this, it was the Arab Spring. And yes, all those who hate the Iraq War and who hate the Americans will say, oh yes, Iraq caused the Arab Spring. I don't accept that. I think that's far too simplistic. We prepared a third-rate Iraqi government, the best we could get, and a second-rate Iraqi army to hold that country together by 2011. And they then faced an extraordinary challenge from Islamic State. But in the end, after years of failure and fighting, they retook Mosul in what inspired me, which is, this is the war that draws my emotions out. And I watched the fighting through Mosul, and I watched the success of the Iraqi army, and I watched the Australian Special Forces, a lot of whom stood behind the Iraqi army as they fought through that city. It's all too simplistic, even after 20 years, to say this was caused by that, this was caused by that. Let's never forget, and I'll finish on this if I may, let's never forget that we may have to intervene for self-defence reasons in other countries in the future, and we better learn the lessons.